Today, authorities pieced together the moments that led up to a fatal mid-air helicopter collision on the Gold Coast.
There's a lot of work for us to do now into trying to get a better picture of exactly what occurred.
Australia's Chief Medical Officer advised against imposing mandatory COVID testing on travellers from China. Mourners turn out en masse to view the coffin of soccer great Pelé at his home ground. And Alex de Minaur beats tennis titan Rafael Nadal at the United Cup in Sydney. Hello and welcome to ABC News. I'm Dan Borscher, coming to you from the lands of the Gadigal people. Authorities investigating a fatal mid-air helicopter collision on the Gold Coast have confirmed one of the victims is Australian pilot Ash Jenkinson and say at least two others were British citizens. 4 people died and 3 remain in a critical condition after 2 choppers collided near the SeaWorld theme park yesterday. The moment of impact occurred just after one helicopter took off and the other was attempting to land. Authorities say the force of the crash separated the main rotor blades and gearbox of the aircraft taking off, which then crashed into the ground. The incident has sent shockwaves through the Gold Coast tourism industry, and multiple investigations are now underway to determine what happened in the lead up to the tragedy. Heidi Sheehan joins me now from the Gold Coast. Heidi, we have more details about the victims.
Good morning. Yes, as the day goes on, we are finding more and more about the victims of this devastating incident. We know 4 people were killed, including Gold Coast helicopter pilot Ashley Jenkinson. Among the people dead, there was also a couple from the UK, aged 57 and 65 years old, as well as a woman from New South Wales in her 30s. We know Ash Jenkinson. We've been chatting to a few friends of his today, and they all have only kind words to say. They say he was a man with a heart of gold who would do anything for anyone and just a great bloke to be around. They've spoken about everything Ash did during the floods in northern New South Wales early last year. He flew and assisted people in those floods with food drop-offs and however he could. Here's a bit about what his mate Andy had to say when he found out it was Ash.
I saw some photos come up on social media, so obviously straight away I tried to ring Ash, make contact, but yeah, there was no answer, so I rang a friend of mine, Ross Meadows, and yeah, he gave me the unfortunate news. It was a bit gut-wrenching and nerve-wracking. You know, I guess to have a helicopter crash is pretty, I guess if to survive out of that at something at that height, yeah, it'd be pretty, it'd be a bit of a miracle. So that it's, on the fortunate side, there were some people that came out of it, and some that didn't. One of them was Ash.
There were 3 others on board that same helicopter. They all were taken to hospital in critical conditions. They include a woman in her 30s and 2 children aged 9 and 10 years old. And we're hearing that those 2 children remain in a critical condition currently.
And Heidi, authorities have just given an update on the investigation. What will they be focusing on?
With this incident, there were so many witnesses. It happened next to the SeaWorld theme park at the Broadwater on a very busy day on the Gold Coast. There were many families out and about on their boats, their jet skis, people across the water, as well as people at the theme park as well. So many of those eyewitness accounts will form part of this investigation, as well as footage. Authorities, the Queensland Police as well as the Australian Transport Safety Bureau, have just managed to retrieve the wreckages of both aircraft. It was a bit of a challenging and delicate operation given the location on a sandbank, and the rising tides meant both wreckages were partially submerged at one point, but they've managed to bring in cranes and get those out. They will then begin the arduous task of trying to reassemble and repiece to work out what exactly caused this devastating crash. Here's a bit of what that investigation will entail.
We know the takeoff and the landing phases of any aircraft operations are critical phases of flight where the cognitive workload of pilots are at their greatest. What we do need to know now is what was occurring inside those two cockpits at the time. We do have multiple accounts from witnesses and, as I said, a video, but equally we'll get what we can from those two helicopters to try and get a better picture of what was occurring, but equally what were the processes in place that are designed to actually protect helicopters in this situation. We know that it's a busy time of the year. We know helicopters are in and out of that SeaWorld helipad constantly throughout the day, so we'll certainly be looking at multiple lines of inquiry here around the procedures that were in place.
Authorities have also commended the actions of the other pilot involved in this collision. He managed to get himself and his 5 passengers to the ground with a damaged aircraft. Everyone only suffering minor injuries on board that aircraft. So for something that has been a devastating tragedy, 4 lives lost, 3 critically injured, authorities say it really could have been much worse.
Heidi Sheehan reporting from the Gold Coast. The government is standing by its decision to ignore advice from the Chief Medical Officer by imposing new COVID measures on travellers arriving from China. The opposition is demanding Australians be given a full explanation on the move. Political reporter Andrew Green joins us from Canberra. Andrew, firstly, talk us through what the Chief Medical Officer has said.
Well, you'll recall, Dan, that on New Year's Day, the Federal Health Minister announced these new testing requirements would be coming into effect this week for travellers from mainland China, Hong Kong and Macau. That's because of the surging COVID case numbers in China and the fear of new variants. But what we've subsequently learnt is that this move was in direct contradiction to advice provided the day before in written form by Australia's Chief Medical Officer, Professor Paul Kelly. In a letter that's been published by the Health Department, he says that there was not sufficient public health rationale for imposing these new testing requirements from passengers arriving from China, and that without a specific threat being present and with Australia's high vaccination rates, it really was an unnecessary step. Well, the opposition today is demanding answers from the federal government through its shadow mental health spokesperson, Melissa McIntosh. It's demanding a full explanation. Let's take a listen.
I think Australians very much deserve answers when it comes to the government's decision. Why did the government go against the Chief Medical Officer's advice? And what's the plan now they've implemented these restrictions?
So, Andrew, just what has the government had to say?
Well, consistently since making this announcement on January 1, federal ministers have said they're doing so out of an abundance of caution. You'll recall that other countries imposed these same screening requirements from aircraft arriving from China over recent weeks. Australia took a little longer. The government says that it's continuing to take the medical advice from chief medical officers seriously, but on balance it had to make a decision to protect Australians, and they argue, various ministers, that Australia just doesn't need to have more COVID cases arriving, and also pointing to the fact that Beijing is not sharing the COVID information that other nations are. So Australia essentially has to do additional screening of arrivals from China. Let's hear from the government frontbencher Murray Watt, who was pressed on this issue today.
We have actually accepted a number of recommendations of the Chief Medical Officer, for instance, testing wastewater in airlines that are coming in from China, and that's particularly to try to get a grip on what kind of variants might be in China at the moment. And that's the fundamental issue here, is that even the World Health Organization made the statement on the weekend that China, unfortunately, has not been transparent as to the types of variants that are in place, the numbers of people who are affected, and that's why Australia is one of a number of countries around the world that has taken this action.
Emergency Management Minister Murray Watt there, speaking to reporters in South Australia. We do know that these measures come into effect very soon. In fact, from midnight on Thursday, people intending to fly to Australia from China will have to submit a negative PCR or an assisted RAT test to show that they don't have the virus. The government has also overnight published some of the specifics of these new rules, including exemptions for anyone under the age of 12.
Andrew Green reporting from Canberra. Police officers have cordoned off a street in Hobart's northern suburbs where a man was found dead overnight. Here's reporter Adam Langerberg.
Police officers were called to Black Snake Road in Granton at about 1:30 this morning after receiving reports of gunshots. When they got here, they found a man deceased outside a house and another man with non-life-threatening head injuries inside the house. He's been taken to the Royal Hobart Hospital. Now, police have cordoned off the road and they're stopping most traffic from entering the area. Neighbours are obviously quite distressed about what's happened on their street, but say they didn't hear gunshots themselves. It's hoped that police will provide more information about exactly what happened here later this afternoon.
Surf lifesavers are again urging caution around water this summer following a number of tragic drownings. Ariana Levy reports from Sydney.
It's been a tragic start to the new year. Yesterday at about 1 p.m. in the afternoon, emergency services were called to New Brighton Beach on the state's far north coast following reports of two men that were found unresponsive. The first man, a 27-year-old, had been pulled from the surf by lifesavers and an off-duty nurse, and they had attempted to perform CPR on the man, and unfortunately he was unable to be revived. Meanwhile, his 28-year-old friend had actually collapsed on the beach a short time before. Emergency services treated the man on the scene, and he has been transported to Tweed Hospital, where he is expected to make a full recovery and is in a stable condition. Now, these spates of ocean tragedies, not only in New South Wales but across the country, have prompted Royal Surf Lifesaving Australia to put swimmers on notice. They're urging swimmers to be extra cautious this summer period and to make sure they take the necessary precautions to be safe. In particular, in New South Wales, there have already been dozens of resuscitations performed on beaches, as well as nearly 1,000 water-related rescues since Christmas Day alone. And in total, we've seen more than 23 drownings since the start of December across the country. Now, surf lifesavers in New South Wales say that it's a combination of not only the hot weather conditions, but also the easing of restrictions across the country for the first time since the pandemic. That's seen many people flock to beaches and actually increase the risk of people that are entering the water. So authorities are urging people that if they want to attend beaches like this one over the summer period, to make sure you swim between the red and yellow flags and swim to the conditions that you're capable of. That's not only to keep people safe this summer, but also to prevent further loss of life.
A luxury cruise ship which was denied entry into Australia for more than a week has finally docked. Reporter Isabella Tolhurst is at the Port of Melbourne.
Hundreds of passengers were finally able to set foot to dry land last night when the Viking Orion cruise ship docked for the first time in over a week. The luxury cruise ship took off from Wellington on Boxing Day, and it was meant to make stops in Christchurch, Dunedin, Hobart and Adelaide. But due to a build-up of biofoul on the ship's hull, it was unable to dock. Now, that includes algae, small plants and other small animals that create a potentially hazardous marine environment that prevented it from being able to dock. Australian authorities demanded that the boat be cleaned, and so professional divers were sent out to the ship 22 kilometres off the coast of South Australia, where they cleared up the ship, and it was finally able to dock here in Port Melbourne last night. Now, passengers who paid thousands of dollars for tickets on this cruise ship have taken to social media saying that they're unhappy with their experience and that their cruise has been ruined. However, representatives from Viking Cruises say that they're working directly with customers to ensure that they are compensated for the impact that this has had on their holiday. Now, the ship has left the Port of Melbourne and is on its way to Sydney today, and hopefully it will be all smooth sailing from here.
The South Australian and federal governments have announced a new $126 million disaster support package to help the state recover from its flood emergency. Almost 3,500 homes have been impacted by flooding, including 293 primary residents, but not all of these properties have water over the floors. The slow-moving flood peak is expected to take some time to fully pass through the River Murray. The funding includes grants for $50,000 for businesses and $75,000 for primary producers. SA Premier Peter Malinauskas says the funding pledge will help people rebuild.
We know that the clean-up effort is going to be big on both public property but also private property as well. So $60 million has been allocated towards the clean-up of removing all of that waste that is going to be associated with the flood event after the waters have receded. We know from interstate experience, and this is something we've been paying a lot of attention to, particularly where we saw the New South Wales and Queensland floods, that we know when the waters recede, there is a lot of waste that is left behind that can really act as a prohibitor for people to be able to enjoy the comfort of their own homes or their local communities. So the more resources we can get on the ground around that clean-up, the sooner, the better.
Residents in and around Midday in the far west of New South Wales are being warned the flood emergency could last for weeks, if not months. Reporter Ben Loughran is there.
Residents in Midday are preparing for what could be weeks of flood conditions after the Darling River rose here to 10.3 metres over the weekend. It didn't hit that record 10.7 metres that was predicted by Water New South Wales when the SES issued an evacuation order last Thursday. As it stands, around a dozen properties have been lost in the low-lying areas of the township. However, 35 properties are still under watch as the water may still rise. In the last 24 hours, it has stabilised and remained at that 10.3 metre level, and Water New South Wales are hopeful that the peak has already passed the town. But as the water is unaccounted for, there is no way of telling. Over the weekend, residents have spent the time building levees, sandbagging properties, moving furniture and machinery, and getting ready for what could be a record flood through the area. The SES, the RFS and the police have been doing checks on people to make sure that they have everything they need to prepare for what is possibly to come.
The New South Wales government has vowed to fix the state's flood-ravaged road network. Premier Dominic Perrottet says $500 million will be given to local councils across the state to fix hundreds of thousands of potholes. Helena Burke reports.
Flooding and severe weather throughout 2022 has left New South Wales roads riddled with potholes and landslips. Local councils have struggled to find the money to tackle the severe damage, particularly in regional areas. Today, however, the state government has announced it will help foot the bill. $500 million in new funding has been set aside, which will be distributed across local councils to help them fix those potholes along with other road damage. Last month, a report by the NRMA found a backlog of $1.9 billion in funding for councils to repair broken roads across the state. The NRMA has warned this backlog will likely get even bigger as the full extent of the damage from the 2022 floods is realised. Both the NRMA and the state opposition say the $500 million allocation is a good start, but that it will take years and billions of dollars to truly address the problem. 56% of the new funding is expected to go to regional councils, with priority given to those that faced the worst of the flooding last year. This includes council areas like Lithgow, Bathurst, Parkes and Forbes that saw record-breaking floods multiple times throughout 2022. The rest of that funding, around 45%, will go to councils across Greater Sydney.
Put $1.5 billion for state roads in. We know many councils across New South Wales are doing it tough financially, and we believe this $500 million will make a real difference to local councils to get local roads fixed up to scratch as quickly as possible so we can keep people safe on our roads.
The state government says it expects councils to start receiving their money by the end of this month, with work on the potholes to ramp up soon after.
The Russian military has suffered one of its largest losses since its invasion of Ukraine. The Kremlin says 63 of its servicemen were killed in the New Year's Eve missile attack on a Russian base in the Donetsk region, but Ukraine intelligence says the number could be as high as 400.
In a town in eastern Ukraine, rubble and many questions. This used to be a school, apparently turned into a base for Russian soldiers. At around midnight on New Year's Eve, Ukraine struck. How many were killed remains unclear. In Moscow, the army claimed the attack was carried out with rockets supplied by the Americans. But there was also a rare admission of casualties.
As a result of the strike by 4 rockets with high explosive warheads against the temporary deployment point, 63 Russian servicemen were killed.
In Russia, military bloggers were furious. They accused the army of failing to hide its troops and of housing them near ammunition stores. One report said the use of mobile phones by soldiers allowed the building to be located. And here in Kyiv, there were more conflicting reports.
First, the military claimed that 400 Russian troops had been killed. But now it says the number is still being investigated. Eastern Ukraine has seen some of the fiercest battles in recent weeks. The latest Ukrainian attack could be one of the deadliest on Russian forces since the start of the war.
Thousands of Brazilians have descended on the coastal city of Santos for a 24-hour public wake to celebrate the life of football legend Pelé. He was the only player ever to win 3 World Cups. The head of the sport's governing body now wants every country to name a stadium in his honour.
From all over Brazil, mourners made their way to the stadium where Pelé became a household name.
Today is very emotional, very sad to lose the king, but happy for what he has done for our city, for Brazil and for the world.
Pelé's coffin was carried onto the pitch at the home ground of the Santos Football Club, where he spent much of his career. While family members remained close to the open casket, thousands of fans filed past, having waited hours for the chance to pay their respects.
It's painful for us Santos fans because he is a world figure that leaves us, but he leaves a gigantic legacy.
Pelé represents the good side of Brazil, the courage, the determination and the possibility.
And here comes Pelé in the last...
Widely considered to be one of, if not the best, footballers of all time, Pelé died at the age of 82 after being diagnosed with colon cancer. FIFA's president argues he should be remembered with a stadium named after him in every country.
Youth all over the world, future generations, have to know and remember who Pelé was and the joy that he brought to the world.
A tribute to a global star who'll be missed most at home. Jade McMillan, ABC News.
A former world #1 tennis player, Martina Navratilova, has been diagnosed with throat and breast cancer. The 66-year-old Czech-American player says the diagnosis is serious but fixable, but she won't be travelling to Melbourne to help cover the Australian Open later this month. She won 18 Grand Slam singles titles and 31 in women's doubles and 10 in mixed doubles. Finance Now, here's Sue Lannon. And Sue, a fall in home prices for the year.
Yes, that is because of steep interest rate rises, which started in May last year by the Reserve Bank. So we've actually seen the biggest annual drop in home prices since 2008, which was the global financial crisis. CoreLogic says national home prices fell by more than 5% over 2022. We did see prices rise over the year in Perth, Adelaide and Darwin. They fell by 12% though in Sydney and by 8% in Melbourne. Now looking to regional Australia, it was a mixed picture. The national prices were little changed over the year, according to CoreLogic. Prices soared on an annual basis in country South Australia, especially the Barossa Valley, but prices fell in regional Victoria and New South Wales. For more, I'm joined by Eliza Owen, Head of Australian Research at CoreLogic. Thanks so much for joining us. So we've seen the first fall in home prices since 2018. What happened across the housing market?
Yeah, thanks, Sue. It's been a very contrasting year for housing market performance. We saw very strong growth in the first 4 months of the year. And then from that peak, property prices have fallen about 8%. So it's definitely on track to be one of the steepest downturns that we've seen on record. And as you say, a pretty big annual drop in terms of a calendar year fall of 5.3%.
And there were big differences across the country. Prices slumped in Melbourne and Sydney, but held up in somewhere like Adelaide and the rest of South Australia. Why was that?
I think it largely comes back to affordability. When you look at Adelaide and regional South Australia, values there are much lower than $1 million market like Sydney. So people are having to extend themselves less with mortgage debt to buy into them, so perhaps not as affected by interest rates. But we've also seen across South Australia really good economic performance through the pandemic off the back of positive interstate migration, rising levels of employment, and the result has been a stronger gross state product outcome than what we would have seen potentially without COVID, according to the ABS. So that's put additional pressure on housing demand as well.
Now, regional prices fell by less. Is that because prices were cheaper there already, and when they rose, they came off a lower base?
I think that has a big part to do with it. Again, it comes back to that affordability piece. So regional Australia had a larger, more extended upswing, and this led to values being higher relative to where they were at the pandemic. But interestingly, the past quarter has seen a pretty sharp fall across combined regional Australia, values down about 3.2%, so not far off what we're seeing across the combined capitals at 3.3%.
And where do you expect prices overall to go in 2023? We've had some housing analysts predicting a 20% fall.
I think that we could continue to see price falls in the first half of the year, particularly as the cash rate is expected to keep rising, potentially peaking by midway through the year. And then through that, we'll probably get a bit of a trough in the downswing in line with that interest rate trajectory.
Now, many borrowers are facing a mortgage cliff when their fixed term rates expire. How serious could this be?
It's a fair chunk of mortgage holders that could be affected. According to RBA analysis, about 23% of outstanding mortgage debt is on fixed terms that will expire over 2023. So you're talking about some people facing a sticker shock, going from a mortgage rate of 2% or less into an environment where average mortgage rates are about 5 to 6%. So there's a significant sticker shock risk.
And now turning to the rental market, again, vacancies are very, very tight. Rents have soared. What's happening in the rental market?
So the rental market has really more been tied to demographic trends than interest rates. Fewer people per household, and the recent return of overseas migration has seen a re-acceleration in annual rent growth, where they're up about 10.2% over the past 12 months. In 2023, we expect Sydney and Melbourne to be the most affected in terms of continually rising rents because they account for the majority of overseas migration. So most people returning or coming to Australia from overseas are initially renters, and that's where we expect that additional pressure to come from.
Eliza Owen, Head of Australian Research at CoreLogic. Thanks for joining us. Now, the Australian share market has been sold off on the first trading day of the year, trading around a 2-month low. Let's have a look at the numbers. The All Ordinaries and the ASX 200 have lost about 1.5%, and all sectors are in the red, with energy and banks leading the losses. So let's have a look at some of those movers. In fact, coal miners are the biggest losers on the ASX 200. They've been hit by another contraction in factory production in China last month. So New Hope and Whitehaven Coal are the biggest losers in the ASX 200. Going up today, the gold miner De Grey Mining and the gaming firm Tabcorp. And the Australian dollar is also weaker on those China figures. It's buying around 67.9 US cents, weaker against other major currencies. And that's finance.
Thanks very much, Sue. Sue London with finance there. Time for a look now at the weather. Here's Emma Rebelato.
On the satellite picture, that tropical low over the Kimberley is dragging large amounts of moisture over the northwest, bringing heavy rain and storms along with severe weather warnings, while troughs over the southeast and southwest are funneling warm air southward, and that's causing showers and storms. So heavy falls again in the north with some showers in the eastern states. Ex-tropical cyclone Ellie could redevelop and track back towards the southeast, and that'll bring heavy falls to the interior of Australia, while parts of the eastern states could see a few more showers over coming days. Looking at tomorrow's weather, and Brisbane, a shower or two and possible storm with 33 degrees. Sydney, showers and the chance of a storm with 26. Canberra, a shower or two, a possible storm there as well with 22. Melbourne, windy with a shower or two, 18. Hobart is looking at a cloudy day with 19 degrees. Cloudy for Adelaide with 23. Perth, sunny and a very warm 36. And Darwin, showers and a possible storm with 31 degrees.
And you can keep up to date at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. Here are the top stories on ABC News. Queensland Police have been contacting the relatives of 4 people killed in a mid-air collision between 2 helicopters on the Gold Coast. 3 other people remain in a critical condition in hospital. Those killed were a British couple aged 57 and 65, a 36-year-old Sydney woman and the pilot, 40-year-old Ashley Jenkinson. The federal government says it made sense to impose COVID screening measures on visitors coming into Australia from China, despite the advice of the Chief Medical Officer. Professor Paul Kelly wrote to Health Minister Mark Butler saying there was not a sufficient public health rationale for the new restrictions and it would be inconsistent with the national approach to living with the virus. The government says too little is known about the COVID crisis in China, and that's why the measure was taken. Thousands of mourners are filing past the body of soccer great Pelé at the ground of his hometown team, Santos. He died last week at the age of 82 following treatment for cancer. His coffin has been draped in the flags of Brazil and the Santos FC soccer club and placed on midfield area in the stadium outside Sao Paulo. Australia's Alex de Minaur has beaten 22-time Grand Slam champion Rafael Nadal at the United Cup in Sydney. The 23-year-old beat the Spaniard 3-6, 6-1, 7-5. It's the first time the Australian player has beaten one of the top 2 players in the world. Let's get more now on the fatal helicopter collision on the Gold Coast. Authorities have detailed how they believed the incident unfolded.
What we do know at this very early stage of the investigation is that one helicopter was taking off. That's had 7 people on board. Another one coming into land with 6 people on board. Now, they've collided. The one helicopter that was taking off appears its main rotors have collided with the landing helicopter, caused considerable damage to the front section of that helicopter. In the process of that collision, the main rotor blades and gearbox of the helicopter taking off have separated from the aircraft, causing it to tragically crash down onto a sandbar. The second helicopter coming into land, now that has remarkably managed to land upright, and considering the damage that was done to the front left-hand section of that helicopter where the pilot was sitting, that's been a remarkable achievement.
Joining me now is aviation safety expert, Professor Ron Bartich from Avlaw Consulting. Thanks for joining me. What's your assessment of what happened here, Professor?
Look, it appears at this stage that obviously the 2 aircraft didn't see each other at the critical time, and the type of airspace they're operating in requires visual separation by the pilots. That's the operating rules of the airspace.
You've spent your life in and around aviation safety. Are there no other systems in place that are checking where helicopters are in relation to each other except for that visual check?
Look, unlike airspace at major airports like Brisbane and Sydney, the aircraft aren't under positive radar control. So the owing to means that they've got of maintaining separation is by visual and oral means. So they were both presumably on the same radio frequency, And because the two aircraft operated by the same operator, they would no doubt have procedures involved in taking off and landing. I guess the only thing that you could sort of indicate that the aircraft is what's known as an EC-130. The pilot is located on the left-hand seat, and there is the availability of two passengers to sit adjacent to that pilot. So whether or not the ATSB will, obviously they'll investigate all the relevant aspects. That may have been a consideration in terms of what happened.
Well, in terms of that investigation, do you think it needs to look into those sort of systems or procedures that are in place if there are multiple helicopters in an area?
Look, I've got no doubt as to the competency of the ATSB. They will look at all relevant factors, and that includes human factors. It includes the operating procedures at the aircraft. It will have a look at the consideration of the type of airspace and how pilots maintain separation, and it will have a look at the background of the pilots in terms of their flight and duty times, their experience, and also the mechanical airworthiness aspects of the aircraft. But at this stage, I guess their main concentration is because they don't have the sophistication of the same degree of flight data recorders and cockpit voice recorders that they have in large aircraft. So I think they'll be very reliant on visual footage that people in the area may have taken at the time.
Do you have any reason to suspect that mechanical issues may have played a part in this?
Again, it's too early to speculate, and the ATSB I have full confidence in when they hand down their final report. But look, just on the face of it, it doesn't appear that there were any mechanical failures at the time. I think the pilot of the aircraft that was descending did a brilliant job in being able to land it on the sandbank at the time, because it could have indeed been a lot worse than what it is already.
Yeah, indeed. Professor, we've heard that the tourism industry on the Gold Coast is a very small and tight-knit industry. I wonder if it's similar for aviation, and particularly for helicopter aviation.
Look, helicopter, rotary and general aviation industry is a very small, tightly knit community, and when something like this happens, I know as a pilot myself, it really brings home to reality what the environment that you're operating in. But already I've spoken to a lot of my friends that have been close friends with the chief pilot, or former chief pilot, and that. And our condolences go out to all those involved, the family and the friends of the people, and that is the general feeling within the aviation community.
Well, given those tight-knit connections, how are you feeling?
Look, I guess I've been flying for 40 years, and I know, I've lost a lot of close friends, in aircraft accidents, and I guess it just hits home the nature of what we're dealing with. When we're flying, or when people are flying every day, you feel confident and all that, but it just it's a tragic reminder of what's out there, and the vigilance and the precautions and risk management you have to exercise on a daily basis.
Well, my condolences to you too, Ron. Thank you so very much. Aviation safety expert Professor Ron Bartish from Avlaw Consulting.
Thank you.
The country's top health official advised the government against imposing COVID testing requirements on travellers arriving from China. On New Year's Day, the government announced any travellers coming into Australia from this Thursday would need to test negative to COVID-19 before departure. However, Australia's Chief Medical Officer, Professor Paul Kelly, had advised the Health Minister against it, saying the move would be disproportionate to the risk posed by the outbreak in China and is inconsistent with Australia's national approach to living with the virus. Infectious disease physician and microbiologist with the University of Queensland, Dr. Paul Griffin, agrees.
Well, we know that new variants are continuing to emerge across the world. It's not solely the case that these variants are emerging in China. We've got a new concerning subvariant in the US, for example. So I think imposing additional testing requirements in any one country fails to appreciate the bigger picture that really we need to be looking for new subvariants across the board and making sure that we've got a response that adapts accordingly. And so focusing on any one country, I don't think achieves that.
Meanwhile, the university sector has encouraged international students from China not to let travel restrictions impede the resumption of their studies this year.
What's really important here is this is not an impediment to Chinese students returning to Australia. It just means they need to have a test before they get on that aeroplane. We said when this was announced on New Year's Day that we hope this is a short-lived temporary measure.
The federal government is under renewed pressure to wind back its decision to cut the number of subsidised psychology sessions just days after they were halved. The number of rebated sessions available was temporarily doubled in 2020 to deal with mental health issues during the pandemic. Shadow Assistant Minister for Mental Health and Suicide Prevention, Melissa McIntosh, says the government's rationale for the cuts doesn't stack up.
These are not wealthy people who are robbing mental health sessions from people who can't afford it. These are everyday Australians who are in great need right now. I think the government really needs to have a serious look at this decision, listen to the people who are calling out for the decision to be reversed. It is not politicians calling out, it is psychologists, leading psychologists in our country, and it is everyday Australians who have been needing these sessions. We do need them reinstated. I think, if anything, the government should be actually progressing forward, and I'd be calling for a national summit on mental health where we look at issues like workforce shortages, because tackling these big issues when it comes to mental health is the only way we're going to address some of those concerns around wait lists and around accessibility for mental health for all Australians.
New data shows lost migration due to the pandemic will amount to a total similar to the population of Canberra. The numbers from the federal government's population report also show overseas migration is expected to bounce back to pre-pandemic levels this year. Joining me to break down these figures is ANU School of Demography lecturer Ching Kwon. Welcome to the program.
Hi, Dan.
What did you take from this latest report?
So we all know the COVID pandemic had a hit on the Australian international migration, and the government has closed the border to temporary migrants for a prolonged period. And that had a hit on the intake of temporary migrants, including international students and temporary skilled migrants, for over 1 year period. That had some hit on the job market in terms of that those students and temporary skilled migrants, they have been a key factor, a player in the labour market, and the pandemic had a role that putting these numbers down, which gives us some hustles in the labour market that we are seeing these days in the workforce.
Have you been looking particularly at some of those hurdles in the workforce, and as you mentioned there, in higher education as well?
We do, at ANU, we do see the slowly increase in students on campus, but with this online course or dual course delivery, we did, during the pandemic, have a lot of students enrolled from overseas, and with the border reopened before Christmas last year, we had more and more students coming back into ANU, and I believe also other university campuses over the last year period.
And part of this report, Ching, indicates that the government believes overseas migration is set to bounce back this year to pre-pandemic levels. Is that what you take from this report?
Yeah, I think that's a clear message from their forecasting that international migration level is going to be recuperate to pre-pandemic level. And that was a optimistic kind of forecasting, and we've seen some of the recuperations already happening last year during the border reopened in Australia in 2022.
Were there any other trends that you noticed from this latest reporting round?
I did notice a gradual increase, a little bit slower than we expected in terms of the student numbers increase, but we do have a peak of the students increase in the mid-2020 2022, where we know it's where the semester started for the winter season, the semester 2 in most universities across Australia. And then that number gradually lowering back to pre-pandemic level. And that was also part of the forecasted numbers that this report is projecting for the future years.
Yeah, and Ching, as a demographer, you've been looking very closely at these numbers and researching this. Was there anything, I guess, that surprised you from this report that was unexpected, perhaps?
I would say I would expect a more fluctuation in terms of international migration because, as we know, migration compared to the two main demographic components, fertility and mortality, is the most vibrant kind of component. It changed a lot and it responds quite quickly to policies. As we see during the pandemic, the border closure has a great hit on international migration, not only Australia, but also across the world. So I would expect a bit more fluctuation in numbers instead of a straight recuperation to pre-pandemic level and a stable numbers of international migration in Australia.
Do you have a sense of why there haven't been those fluctuations that you mentioned or a greater variance in those fluctuations?
Well, there are many things that can have an impact on international migration. Policy is one thing. The other thing is things like war or pandemic, like we've been seeing in the last few years, especially at the beginning of the pandemic, many of the temporary migrants, they are facing certain visa restrictions that didn't allow them to stay in Australia for a longer period. And that's also why we see a higher numbers of temporary migrants living in Australia compared to those Australian citizens and permanent migrant visa recipients. And there were lots of uncertainties around the time of the pandemic and policy changes. So I would expect fluctuations to happen when certain great events happened.
Ching, look, it seems really obvious that the COVID-19 pandemic had an enormous impact on migration. What are the lessons that you think we need to take from this last couple of years and clearly the months ahead about migration into the future?
I think one of the important lessons is we can't always plan ahead. But
I think that's been the big problem we've all faced, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's always good to have some kind of planning in terms of different scenarios we might face in the future. And this is also one of the methods we use in academia, doing certain scenario analysis to project future migration. Not necessarily certain numbers, but in terms of when another pandemic happened, which hopefully not, or other certain things happen that might have an impact on international migration and many other population events, then we can kind of familiarize or sensitize policymakers to certain possibilities in future population event.
Yeah, I think most of us will be hoping it's the last pandemic we see in our lifetimes. Thanks so much for joining us, Ching, from the ANU School of Demography, Ching Kwan. Thousands of people have begun paying their respects to the former Pope Benedict XVI, who died on the weekend. His body is now lying in state in St. Peter's Basilica at the Vatican ahead of his funeral on Thursday.
At dawn, the late Pope was moved from the monastery in the Vatican where he died for the short, solemn, private procession to St. Peter's Basilica. There he was taken through the nave to be placed in front of the altar. Outside, while this ceremony was taking place, thousands had formed a queue that snaked around St. Peter's Square. These were among the first allowed in through the doors to pay their respects. In just the first 5 hours, Vatican police say 40,000 people filed past Benedict XVI, and they came from all over the Catholic world.
It's just one of those once-in-a-lifetime moments where you kind of feel quite more and more emotional as you get closer to viewing, the Pope's body and realise the impact that he's had, I guess, on everybody. So there was a kind of a sombre mood as the walk progressed.
What was that moment like for you when you were paying respects?
That moment I feel so honoured because Pope Benedict was a servant of God. We honour him. We follow his example.
There's been much discussion about the failings of Pope Benedict, particularly in dealing with abuse perpetrators. But those here today were focused on paying tribute to a man they felt was a great theologian and who dedicated his life to the church.
Time now for sport with Catherine Murphy. Welcome, Catherine. In cricket, the Pink Test starts tomorrow in Sydney, but we still don't know the Australian lineup.
Hello to you, Dan. We don't. Now, we think that the Australian captain, Pat Cummins, has finalised his squad, but he's not revealing anything just yet. Here is Daniela Intilli with Matt Clinch to preview tomorrow's test.
Matt Clinch from ABC Sport joins me. You'll be covering this test for ABC Sport. The interesting question Pat Cummins was asked was whether he knew what the final 11 was, but he is not going to say anything until the final toss. What did you make of that?
No, he's keeping his cards very close up his sleeve. So Australia's won the series against South Africa. Now it's just a question of can they have a whitewash and win 3-0, and the possibility to potentially prepare a little bit as well for the upcoming tour against India. So do they want to play two spinners, or will they go with the possibility of unleashing Lance Morris? So it's a scenario the Australian selectors haven't had to deal with too often. The fact that they've got a couple of injuries, Mitchell Stark is out and Cameron Green as well. The upside for an Australian point of view is they've had South Africa comfortably beaten when it comes to the batting front. But yeah, Pat Cummins has his 11, but he wouldn't tell us today who it was.
2023, doing things a bit differently. No, we're settled on our 11, but we're just going to let everyone know. Make sure all the players know first, and yeah, we'll probably announce it tomorrow at the toss.
We've touched on there potentially being two spinners. It's not just this test, but there's plenty to look ahead for, like the test in India.
Yeah, and I think that's the logic with Ashton Agar. In a bowling sense, he probably hasn't been the second best spinner when it comes to trying to select who might be getting that opportunity, but they did play Mitchell Swepson overseas. He probably didn't lock in that position. So Agar has only played, I think, the 2 red ball games since early in 2021. So not a lot of form for the selectors to pick him on, but he does offer that spinning variation. He can bat in a handy position to support Alex Carey, and is a great fielder as well. So I think that's the debate as to whether they bat Alex Carey one more spot up the order, bat potentially at 6 and play the extra bowler, or whether they feel like they bring in maybe a Marcus Harris who's been around the squad for a lot of the summer but hasn't had his opportunity yet.
And we are talking a bit about the pitch. We had the SCG curator Adam Lewis talk about it. He admitted it was challenging. Let's hear what he had to say.
It's not quite what we've seen in the last few years. A few of the players have told me it looks like a wicket about 10 years ago, which gave me a bit of confidence. So, it's a bit thin on grass, a little bit patchy. Probably not the best looking pitch that we've seen, but look, we're looking forward to it. We've done the best that we can, and hopefully it's going to be a really good test.
And I'm going to put you on the spot, but for the final team makeup, do you think we are going to see those two spinners?
No. My gut says no. I don't know, to be totally honest. I think Pat Cummins has played it pretty close to his heart, but I feel like they'll play the bowler. I think Lance Morris will come in and Josh Hazlewood will play. So I think that'll be their 11. South Africa were able to pass 200 for the first time in 8 consecutive innings, but Australia have been more than comfortable with the bat. So I think they know they've got runs on the board.
We'll wait and see tomorrow if your prediction is correct.
Indeed we will. Let's head to the tennis now. Catherine, and Alex de Minaur notched up the biggest win of his career last night, and he did it on his favourite court.
He did indeed, Dan. This was a heartwarming victory for Alex de Minaur on Ken Rosewall Arena against none other than the 22-time Grand Slam champion, the greatest of all time if you're just counting slams, Rafael Nadal, the biggest win of Alex de Minaur's career. He's always talked about how much he loves playing for his country. Now, this was a dead rubber, but I'm tipping that Alex de Minaur doesn't know the meaning of a dead rubber. The guy just can't put in anything but 120% effort. He's a legend who loves playing on this court. Have a listen, Dan, to what he had to say after that win.
Look, honestly, whenever I get a chance to play for Australia, I'm a true believer in there being no greater honour than representing your country. So every time there's an opportunity, I'll put my hand up, and I love doing it. I love playing for Australia, and I'll keep doing it with a smile on my face.
Doesn't that just give you goosebumps? The reason Alex de Minaur loves that court so much, it's not just his home court, of course, because he is a Sydney-sider, but he won the last ever Sydney International Tournament in 2019. I was lucky enough to be there that year. He wanted it so badly to win on his home court, and he achieved that, and it's a special place for him, Dan. He has been playing with Australia even before he played for Australia, if that makes sense. He was an orange boy for the Davis Cup team at the age of 17. Australia just lost the Davis Cup final in November against Canada. He is so dedicated to representing his country. I'm so delighted for him, and I have very good news for you, Dan. I have a surprise. Later on Newschannel, just before 4 p.m, the legend that is the Demon will be joining us live on Newschannel to tell us, Dan, what's it like waking up the morning after you've defeated the 22-time Grand Slam winning champion, Rafael Nadal. He'll be joining us just before 4 o'clock.
I'll be looking forward to that one, and I'm sure that you've got some Perla questions for him as well.
Cannot wait for that one. Cannot wait. I'm actually too excited, Dan. Bit too excited. I think our two producers, Isabella and Cam, were at the match. They were in the crowd.
Yeah,
so
right.
we're all excited in the control room as well.
Oh, I can't wait, and I'm sure everyone watching is feeling the same. Hey, another popular Aussie got a win last night and helped clarify Nick Kyrgios's plan for the Australian Open. What's going on here, Catherine?
OK, Thanasi Kokkinakis, one half of the special Ks. I would never say which is the better half, which you usually do in a coupling. I would never say which is which.
Risky territory.
But he played at the Adelaide International, and let's give him his singles moment, because he defeated Maxime Cressy 7-6, 7-6. Not an easy task. It took him 2 hours and 11 minutes under a lot of pressure, because this is his home crowd. He's the defending champion, but he got the win. Now, of course, we know him for years. We know him for years, but when we're talking doubles, his greatest achievement alongside Nick Kyrgios was that win in the Australian Open last year. But Nick Kyrgios tweeted about playing doubles with Novak Djokovic. You heard me right, at Indian Wells. That's if Novak Djokovic is allowed into America. Remember at Wimbledon, after Nick lost the final, he said he wanted to go out for dinner with Novak. I'm not sure that that ever happened now. He wants to play doubles. Here's what Nick Kyrgios's real doubles partner had to say about that.
Yeah, the dog, I don't know, he didn't warn me about that. No, he's fine. He's just playing Indian Wells with Nick, with Novak, and yeah, we'll be teaming it up to run it back at Aussie Open again.
That is a relief, because I want to see the special Ks play together again, and we'll just have to wait and see what happens at Indian Wells, Dan.
Looking forward to it. Catherine Murphy with Sport. Thank you.
Thank you.
Time for a look at the weather now. Here's Emma Repalato.
On the satellite picture, that tropical low over the Kimberley is dragging large amounts of moisture over the northwest, bringing heavy rain and storms along with severe weather warnings, while troughs over the southeast and southwest are funneling warm air southward, and that's causing showers and storms. So heavy falls again in the north, with some showers in the eastern states. Ex-tropical cyclone Ellie could redevelop and track back towards the southeast, and that'll bring heavy falls to the interior of Australia, while parts of the eastern states could see a few more showers over coming days. Looking at tomorrow's weather, and Brisbane, a shower or two and possible storm with 33 degrees. Sydney, showers and the chance of a storm with 26. Canberra, a shower or two, a possible storm there as well with 22. Melbourne, windy with a shower or two, 18. Hobart is looking at a cloudy day with 19 degrees. Cloudy for Adelaide with 23. Perth, sunny and a very warm 36. And Darwin, showers and a possible storm with 31 degrees.
And that's the ABC News for now. And a reminder, you can keep up to date on all the latest news across all your devices at news.abc.net.au and on ABC iView. I'm Dan Borscher. Thanks for your company.